Mr. President, I thank my colleague from Maryland, and I thank him for all his work on the Chesapeake and so many important issues as it relates to this issue, and for being here up all night with my colleagues on this important climate issue. And I want to thank Senators Boxer and Whitehouse and Schatz for organizing this and for everybody participating. Obviously, we're here to talk about climate change, but like my colleague, we know that climate change is actually impacting jobs now because it's impacting our climate now. So while we're here to talk about what might happen in the future, I'm here right now to specifically talk about what is happening to our economy today and why we need to take action. Because ocean acidification is an economic issue, and it affects so many different people in our economy in the Pacific Northwest. It affects our shellfish growers, which is a major industry. We have 3 and 4 generations of shellfish growers that are threatened now by the impacts of carbon in our oceans and the warming of our oceans. So when you talk about climate and you talk about acidification of our oceans, you're talking about an industry that is key to the Northwest that is being affected today. Also, our crab fishermen are being affected today. Actually, our crab fishermen. Our crab fishermen, which are an important part of our fishing industry all the way to the Bering Sea, which a lot of people don't realize that the Alaska crab fishermen are based in Alaska and in Washington State, and they very much depend on making sure that we deal with this issue in the future if we want to protect these jobs and the important industry that it's there, because sea levels are rising and forcing communities to deal with this issue, and we want to help protect these jobs. And even jobs with salmon fishermen, you know, this is, I think, maybe a picture. A lot of people watch Deadliest Catch and understand the seafood industry, but they may not understand that even salmon depend on a food source that is affected by ocean acidification, that is not just killing oysters and shellfish, but it's also killing these pteropods that the salmon industry depends on too. So you can see, Mr. President, that I'm here to talk about this as it relates to jobs, because commercial fishing in Washington State is a $30 billion coastal economy with 42,000 jobs and contributes about $1.7 billion to our gross economic product. So for us, these are impacts of climate that are being felt today. Not in the future, they're being felt today, and it threatens a key industry. Not only is that industry important to Washington State, it's also important to the nation, which it contributes $70 billion to the U.S. economy and supports over 1 million fishing jobs. So our inaction here in Congress, deciding not to do something, basically threatens those 1 million jobs, because the climate is impacting our oceans, and our oceans are impacting this food supply that these fishermen harvest. And if we don't do something about this, we are going to have severe problems in the future. Well, why is this? Well, the key point, if we could have just one chart today played over and over, I would have this chart, which is our oceans absorb 25% of the CO2 emissions. That's right, all the CO2 emissions, 25% of them basically just sink into the ocean. So that means carbon emissions from fossil fuels are being absorbed into the ocean, and that basically creates a very corrosive environment in our waters. So the notion that people think we can continue to do what we're doing and not make a change, I guarantee you the problems that we're causing for our oceans is a serious threat. This graph shows you the kind of acidification that's happening in our seawater. That ocean acidification has increased 30% over the last 200 years, and that oceans are on track to be 150% more acidic by the end of the century. The current rate of acidification is 10 times faster than anything Earth has experienced in the last 50 million years, and as you can see, this increase of carbon and increase of the pH level in water and the increase in acidification is what is causing this problem for us. So again, my colleagues who think this is just something on the other side of the aisle that we don't have to deal with are ignoring the real science and the state of our oceans today. What does that acidification cause? Well, I guess if there was another chart here, I would make this chart also the star of the show, because this is not a science experiment. This is the current state of oyster larvae. Last night I was at a restaurant here in town and they offered Washington oysters, shellfish on the menu. That's great to see. But this is a picture of actual larvae, the beginning stages of these shellfish that are being impacted, and you can see here that this is what acidification is doing to that larvae. It's not able to form. So this particular challenge we saw in 2005 when shellfish production plummeted on the West Coast. It seemed like a freak accident, but then it happened again in 2006 and in 2007. And then in 2008, more than 80% of the oysters at Whiskey Creek Shell Hatchery died before they could be planted into the shellfish farms. In total, billions of shellfish died because of that acidification. And these images from Oregon State University show that ocean acidification does what it does to the larvae, because that acidification erodes and becomes corrosive and actually kills the oysters. Now, as I said, these are third and fourth generation jobs in my state, and it's very important that we protect them. They have been a big driving part of our economy. But when corrosive seawater increases, and then you have a 60% decrease in production, you're talking about hundreds of jobs in Washington state that are being impacted, and we need to do something right now to act. So it doesn't just affect the larvae of oysters, it also, acidification destroys other shellfish. And this again is another example, a pteropod, which just happens to be the calcium source for salmon. So these shellfish are what salmon feed off of for a protein source, and yet these same shells aren't being able to form. Over 30% of the marine life in Puget Sound is a calcifier. So these calcifiers basically are species that are a calcium carbonate shell, and just like the oysters and the shellfish, that needs to form. And that's 30% of our marine life, of our food source. And so if we don't do something about ocean acidification, these shells aren't forming, we are going to have an even more serious impact to our salmon industry in Washington state. So my constituents know that these are big issues. In fact, the Seattle Times ran a groundbreaking series called Sea Change, the highlighting of impact of carbon to the oceans, because it could, as this article details, cause a collapse of that huge Alaska crab fishing industry, a collapse. I know my colleagues from the Northeast are here. They understand what a collapse to a fishing industry means. They understand it means a lot of people without jobs. It means a lot of people who depend on the fishing industry as ancillary or related jobs end up without jobs. They understand that a collapse of a fishing industry means a collapse to the economy overall in their region. So if we don't do something to address acidification, we are talking about climate change impacting a key job sector and causing huge job loss. And that's what this chart shows. Basically, it shows how the crab harvest industry is being impacted by ocean acidification, and that it could cause a very precipitous decline. And we, Mr. President, can't afford that. I'll show you why we can't afford that. We just recently, people might have caught on the West Coast that you might have think that what I just showed you about oysters and about the paratod for salmon source, but scallops, which just had, I think a week ago, a massive die-off, are another canary in the coal mine, because Basically, it shows that 10 million scallops died off the coast of British Columbia, and acidification was the blame. So acid water blamed for West Coast scallop die-off. So it shut down a processing plant and a third of its workforce. So you can see that these things basically are killing jobs. So, Mr. President, ocean acidification kills jobs. Us doing nothing about ocean acidification or about CO2 in the atmosphere is going to cause us economic problems. So I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to make sure that we support measures that will allow us to mitigate now the impacts of this and plan for the future, because we can't have what's happening now. We do have a buoy system that we've deployed all across the United States. That buoy system helps us identify acidification levels and helps the fishermen come up with alternative strategies about when to do their planting. Let's just say it this way. They figure out when is a perfect moment to actually have the seeding. If you have too much CO2 and a warming of the oceans, then figuring out that very moment where it might not be so acidic or challenging, and then actually doing the planting, it's giving us some tools. But these are high-risk tactics, and Mr. President, we actually have to reduce the level of CO2. We're here this morning to talk about how this issue impacts the industry in my state. But this last chart shows you a picture that is irrefutable. Ocean acidification effects on coral. Here is healthy coral, you can see, vibrant, colorful. If you've ever been off of our coast or walking on the beaches, you can see the shell life that exists in a healthy coral reef. This is the same coral reef years later with an unhealthy effect. So, Mr. President, we're here this morning to talk about jobs, to talk about climate and its impact on our economy today. It is important that we address this issue. I have sponsored bipartisan legislation with my colleague on the other side of the aisle called the CLEAR Act. It's just one idea. But the premise of that is that we have to not only reduce greenhouse gases now, we have to mitigate the impacts and plan for a more diverse energy source of the future. That's what we're talking about today. We're talking about trying to save jobs in the United States of America by doing a better job of planning on this important issue. So I'd like to thank the President and yield to my colleague from New Hampshire who is here for a few minutes on this important issue.